Hi there, my name is Alex Shaminov, and this is Political Outline. And today we're going to be talking about the political party dynamic in the United States in the 21st century and how moralistic issues have effectively pervaded the notion of our political election process in the United States and how that, as a result, prevents bipartisanship from occurring. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. Throughout the progression of this video, I might refer to some notes that I have, or I might even just write some things down. This is really just an organic conversation as I'm communicating things from my perspective. For those interested, I am a registered independent. I've been a registered independent for as long as I have been registered, and for the most part, I would describe my own political ideology as being generally socially conservative and from a policy perspective, typically more progressive. We might talk about that in a future video, but today I just want to talk about how the current political party system, in combination with the media sphere that we have, are not actually conducive for moderate candidates. Now, jumping into the concept of what a moderate candidate is, obviously in the United States, we are a country of 340 million plus people, so the actual sphere of ideologies should range quite a bit. And yet, the ideological array of our current House, Senate, Supreme Court, and presidencies or executive branches, and then if we look at the states as kind of the further compound or the further as a further example, really the ideological variability is quite narrow. There's really, for the most part, no such thing as an anti-abortion Democrat. There's also very rarely, if ever, such a thing as a pro-choice Republican. These things don't exist, where even though realistically there could be socially conservative Democrats and there could be socially progressive Republicans. Historically, because these issues really very rarely came to a front within our political spheres, the types of differences and disagreements that we had within our government structure were ideological. The reality is, in the United States, the majority of people have very different views on how the government should be organized. Some people view the government from the perspective of that it is a holistic business entity in which everyone has an equal share. Therefore, the government is the biggest and most responsible representative of the people because it is the only entity that everyone has an equal say in. Considering that, for these ideological people, perhaps the idea of government or the government creating and running a universal healthcare system is not so controversial. Whereas on the conservative end, or typically traditionally more conservative end of things, of individual freedom and liberty, the reality is perhaps the idea of communal-based government is simply against what you individually believe. If your belief is that our founders created our system of government to revolve the premise of individual liberty, then the idea of a communally represented government or a communally interested government making decisions that address or affect the collective would be against your ideological framework. There are also varying ideologies as to how much the individual citizen should participate within their government and how much the government should affect the daily lives of the individual. Who should have the broader responsibility within our government? Is it or within our country? Is the government responsible to solve problems, or is we as people responsible to address problems individually and privately through the systems that we create? These are all legitimate ideological differences. Our founding fathers were an eclectic mess of ideological viewpoints, and the vision of government that they had for the United States varied greatly. However, part of the problem, especially with 21st century politics, is we have infused into our political system moralistic issues that create individual circumstances where, depending on how you lie on these heavily contested issues, you are either perceived as morally good or morally evil or morally wrong, depending on your belief on the issue. Abortion, for an example, is a moralistic issue. While generally speaking, from a representative government point of view, creating a ruling where abortion is, which is a distinctly moral issue, is quite challenging because our government was not designed or created to be an arbiter of morality. From an individual perspective, this is something that is a hot topic issue that many people are concerned about. At the end of the day, how you perceive and understand life is quite important in how you see and perceive the world. If you believe that life begins at conception, your understanding of what life is to an extent fundamentally different than a person who believes otherwise. And unfortunately, from a divides perspective, the simple reality is when you have a country or any region with the tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people that we have, differences in beliefs and perspectives are going to exist, right? The reality is, it doesn't matter how you find yourself on this ideal or this moral, what side you find yourself where this moral issue is concerned. There are people in the United States who believe life does not begin at conception. They believe that a fetus within a womb is not actually a living thing. Realistically, however, on the other side, there is a very large contingent of people who do believe that a fetus is a living thing and should have rights. This is a very controversial and difficult issue to navigate, and the unfortunate reality, I'm not here necessarily to talk about the moral merits of the abortion issue, but what I am here to discuss is how issues such as abortion, which, while it is controversial to say, realistically are fringe incidents. When we look at the whole United States, abortion is simply not something that affects the entirety of the United States. Media today often portrays this as the type of thing that affects all women. However, realistically, if we look at it from that perspective, the reality is all women are not put into a position of wanting to have an abortion or put into a position where having that exists. At the end of the day, while theoretically women could be affected by this, it does not necessarily, by definition, affect all women. Now, that's a very controversial understanding. Today, media and the political sphere associate the concept of abortion with women's health care, which then is something that affects everyone. For the purposes of this video, again, I don't necessarily want to get caught up in the issue of abortion. For the purposes of this video, I am considering abortion from the moralistic perspective rather than the policy perspective. We'll talk about, perhaps in a future video, about abortion from the policy perspective, but ultimately, when we consider this from a moral perspective, it's a very difficult issue for our government to address at all, because again, our government is not designed to be an arbiter of morality. For many people in this country, abortion is a matter of human rights. They believe that it's a matter of human rights. Our government has to be considerate of this viewpoint, as well as considerate of the alternative viewpoint that abortions are considered murder at the end of the day. But at the same time, how is the government supposed to react? So I use the reference that abortion is a fringe issue in the sense that it does not affect all 340 plus million people in the United States. It affects a specific contingent. Some people would argue that it affects approximately half the population in saying that it affects all women. Some people would argue, as I'm, for the purposes of this video, arguing that abortion affects a fraction of women who potentially could be, or who are put in a position of potentially needing or choosing against having an abortion. Considering this, the reality is many other issues have a larger effect. Theoretically, healthcare in the United States has a larger range of effect because it affects all 300 or the majority of the 340 million plus people. Infrastructure affects nearly all of the 340 million plus people. Our national security affects nearly all 340 million people. Energy policy affects nearly all 340 million people. There are many issues that are not moralistically controversial that are, as a result, are alternatively ideologically controversial. It becomes simply a matter of approach. But these issues, which affect the vast majority of our nation, if not the entirety of our nation, are overshadowed and become immediately more controversial because of the viewpoints of the people who have them. From the Republican perspective, who believe that something like abortion is murder, it would be naturally difficult for them to ever support a Democrat who is proposing alternative energy policy because they are viewing that person as morally compromised. When realistically, this is a very complicated issue that from a government's perspective is difficult to actually navigate for the purposes of making illegal. This is a moral issue. And unfortunately, this has divided our nation considerably within the last few decades. It doesn't necessarily matter how you perceive the issue of abortion, realistically, the effect that it has is quite extensive, because it's as a result has an implicit and explicit effect on so many other policy spheres. Now, from the perspective of ideological belief system, the simple reality, the simple fact that our two-party system is not ideologically considerate, or is not considerate of a variety of ideological viewpoints, the reality is we have a system where theoretically you are on one side or you are on the other, and we're pitted against each other simply via the virtue of these moral issues that pit us against each other naturally. And unfortunately, this is quite problematic, because the general sphere of the American populace is quite scattered, and it is quite mixed. There are Democrats in this nation who believe these have a more Republican viewpoint on these moral issues, and there are Republicans who have a more Democratic leaning towards these issues. However, the unfortunate reality is, because we have a two-party political system where these ideologies are effectively skewed into very narrow fields of view or fields of belief, the unfortunate reality is that people are unable to have free ideologies within the political parties that they reside in. And this is entirely problematic. Again, this becomes a battle of good versus evil, as opposed to a united nation of 340 million people who, while have different views and understandings on how we can solve problems, are united under the banner of all being Americans. Now it's whether or not you are a Republican because you are against abortion, or you are a Democrat because you are for choice. It's also interesting that the way the different parties, when we look at this from a moral perspective, it's interesting to consider how the parties frame this question. Both of the political parties that we have, the primary political parties, Republican and Democrat, they both frame this issue of abortion, from a perspective that effectively gives them a moral upper hand. The Democratic view on abortion is that this is an issue of choice. This is individual liberty. This is whether or not the government has the ability to tell you how you can live your life. This becomes an issue of women's health care. This is how we've tried to create a system where as many people are involved within this umbrella of the abortion issue as possible, to make this as universal of an issue as possible. They try to create it so that if you are against this, you are against the fabric or the very notion that is the American ideal of freedom. Alternatively, Republicans frame this as a matter of being pro-life. This too is a moralistic standpoint, wherein if you believe the opposite of it, you're a morally corrupted person. If you are not pro-life, you are implied as being anti-life, which means effectively you believe that it is okay to murder an infant child, right? These are very, very skewed ideological beliefs that the parties effectively try to lump people in to make it so they cannot find a commonality and a common ground with one another. Unfortunately, the reality, it does not necessarily matter how you want to chop up an issue such as this. The reality is these are complicated issues, and these are the types of issues that need to be able to be discussed freely without us as people envisioning or seeing people of opposite viewpoints from us as being A, morally compromised, or B, morally evil. Realistically, it does. If you're a Democrat, you believe in pro-choice. If you are, pro-choice, you are effectively believing that this is a matter of individual human right. It's very difficult to then be sympathetic to a group of people who believe the alternative, because then you are believing that they do not believe in individual human rights. They believe that they do not indeed believe in individual human liberties. If you are a Republican, you believe that the alternative Democrats do not believe in the sanctity of life. From the very beginning, they believe that they need to defend the defenseless, people who cannot speak for themselves because they are not yet born. It's a very troubling kind of circumstance to find ourselves in, and the reason why earlier in the video I described it as a fringe thing, not because it is fringe from the perspective of just willy-nilly and it doesn't actually matter. It matters quite a great deal. However, when we look at it from the perspective of the actual scope of people that it is affecting, there are issues that are completely just ignored, more or less, because of this issue. And from the perspective of government, from my ideological viewpoint, I believe that the government is not meant to be an arbiter of morality. This creates a very difficult issue, supposedly, because we have a democratic republic and people elect leaders or representation who theoretically embody their ideals. If you, depending on your standpoint on this issue, you would vote for people who have similar viewpoints as you do. Um, Personally, I think that this is probably more of a Supreme Court issue rather than it is a legislative issue. I don't think our legislature should be making moralistic determinations because that opens a very dangerous precedent on so many other things. The Supreme Court looks at the constitutionality of things, and as we can see, the Supreme Court is split on this issue. Fascinating to see how even in the Supreme Court, where we have 9 people whose jobs are not on the line, whose livelihoods are not on the line, this is a very controversial and difficult issue for them to decide and figure out. Interesting note to point out. But when we look at all of the spheres of policy, the reality is there are pro-choice Republicans who are fiscally and financially conservative. There are pro-life pro-life Democrats who believe in more progressive more progressive infrastructural policy. Right? There is a mosaic, an entire array of different ideological viewpoints that are essentially drowned out because of these individual fringe issues. Another moralistic issue that is quite unbelievably so divisive is the issue of firearms in our nation. It doesn't matter if you believe if you believe that everyone should have access to firearms or you believe that we should have more restrictive laws. The reality is this is a very controversial issue. It's been controversial in our legislature. It's been controversial in our Supreme Court, and it's been a controversial issue amongst our previous presidents. Looking at this issue, once again, this is a moralistic issue where, depending on your belief, you are either finding a group of people who identify with what you believe, right? If you are, quote unquote, pro-Second Amendment, you are then ingratiating yourself to people who are, quote unquote, pro-Second Amendment. If you are against the idea of everyone and anyone being able to purchase a firearm, and your argument is that you are trying to protect defenseless lives that are put at threat through the open access of firearms, you are ingratiating yourself to people who believe the same thing, and you're alienating yourself from people who believe the opposite. Again, this is a very important issue. Please make no mistake from anything I say in these videos. These moral issues are very important, but the reality is, again, there are a mosaic of ideological viewpoints. There are pro-Second Amendment Democrats. There are anti or pro-gun legislation Republicans. We very rarely see these people in elected office because the process by which we elect leaders through this two-party system is not designed for a diversity of viewpoints. The Republican and the Democratic Party, which push forth and endorse Republican and Democratic candidates, are trying to find people who are good for business, essentially. The Republicans are trying to find Republican candidates that will make the Republican Party look good. Democrats are trying to find Democratic candidates that will make the Democratic Party look good. And by using these issues, again, issues that do not necessarily affect 340 plus million Americans every day, issues that have very important effect, but affect a smaller percentage of people on a day-to-day basis, effectively control and dictate how we are all sorts of our policies because they are moralistic. They're moral issues that if you don't believe the way I believe, you must be implicitly corrupted in your morality, or you very well might be evil in your morality. And unfortunately, these things are not conducive to a effective, successful, and inclusive American society. This is not America at our best. And when you look at the United States government historically, many of the political leaders that we've had have been able to come to various compromises in the face of controversy because quite often they were not plagued with the moralistic issues that we are now plagued with in our regular everyday conversation. This is a really big topic. Morality in politics, morality in government is not something that should be looked at lightly, and it's not necessarily something that and it is something that should be discussed quite regularly. But unfortunately, when we look at the array of issues that affect people's every single day lives, so many things are overshadowed by this. Imagine how many people die every day simply because our healthcare infrastructure, while good, is not as good as it could be. Imagine how much global insecurity is caused by the fact that the United States is not as energy diverse as it has the potential to be. Imagine how many nations question their own safety because our defense policy or our military policy is not as good or efficient as it could be. Imagine how many Americans each and every day are terrified about our domestic safety because our own defense policy is so very controversial. At the end of the day, there are many issues that need a strong hand from our government to guide properly, and yet we can never seem to have open and honest dialogues about these things because our political leaders are ideologically keyholed by moralistic issues that, while very, very, very important, do not affect our every single day lives, quite like all of these other issues. This is a big topic to unpack, and hopefully we'll be able to unpack this in future videos, but ultimately I believe that moralistic policy, or the prevalence of moralistic policy, has done quite a bit to create a divisiveness amongst the American people, and it is something that continues to weaken the strength of what our nation has the potential to be. If you have any thoughts on this topic, I'd love for you to leave a comment down below. Maybe we'll feature that in a future video. If there's anything that I say that you disagree with, I implore you to share your own thoughts so that we can all further our understanding of this. If there's a terminology or a way that I say something that you dislike or you'd like me to clarify, please share your thoughts. I'd love to be able to take a look and perhaps just evolve in my own thinking, whether it is saying things in a more efficient or delicate way, or just changing my own viewpoint. Ultimately, as people, I believe we're all constantly changing our viewpoints because the way we see and perceive things change over time. It's a matter of how much information we have within us that dictates how we see and perceive the world around us. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.